Welcome to today's webinar, New Mobilities, Smart Planning for Emerging Transportation Technologies, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the US EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming programs. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speaker in this webinar are those of the speaker and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org. Log into your account and search for the name of today's event, which is New Mobilities, Smart Planning for Emerging Transportation Technologies. You can also search for event number 9217873. I would also like to acknowledge our partner today, Island Press, and their partnerships manager, Jen Hawes. Founded in 1984, Island Press's mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment and to create solutions to its complex problems. So today we welcome back Todd Litman. Todd is the founder and executive director of the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, an independent research organization dedicated to developing innovative solutions to transport problems. His work helps to expand the range of impacts and options considered in transportation decision-making, improve evaluation methods, and make specialized technical concepts accessible to a larger audience. Todd has worked on numerous studies that evaluate transportation costs, benefits, and innovations. He has worked in more than 24 countries on every continent except Antarctica. He is active in several professional organizations, including the Institute of Transportation Engineers and the Transportation Research Board. Following his presentation, Todd will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. So before we turn it over to Todd, we're going to launch a poll for everybody, as we usually do now, to just see where everybody is from. So you'll see there you have 5 options to choose from. You may need to exit from full screen mode in order to respond to it. And we'll give you another 30 seconds or so to respond. It looks like folks are responding. If you are having trouble, again, please exit full screen mode and you should be able to click on your choice. There's 4 areas of the US generally that we've identified, and we often get an international audience, and looks like we will have one today. Given that Todd is in Canada, that's not too surprising. So we'll share that with you momentarily and turn it over to Todd. So here you can see that the response is, at least for today, about 30% of our audience is in the US Mid-Atlantic Northeast, 24% in the West, 17% South, 16% Midwest, and 13% international, which is pretty high for us. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Todd Litman. Go ahead, Todd. Thank you.
So, greetings friends from Victoria, British Columbia. It's my pleasure to participate in this interesting and fun workshop. I hope I can introduce some new ideas and stimulate some thinking and solution building for some of the emerging challenges to planners. So let's see, there we go. This presentation is based on my book that has just come out it's just released last week. New Mobilities, Smart Planning for Emerging Transportation Technologies. And this book, it's available from Island Press. You'll see that on the screen, there's a discount code. So if you do purchase one through the Island Press website, you'll be able to get a substantial discount. So this presentation is going to be a deep dive into the implications and impacts and rational responses to new transportation technologies. Transportation affects our lives in countless ways, and so new transportation technologies have affected our lives as individuals and our communities in countless ways. And it's kind of fun to go back and look at how previous transportation innovations were viewed at the time. How the future of transportation was predicted. So it's really fun, for example, to look at the covers of various magazines, Popular Mechanics and Popular Sciences, and see what our transportation system was predicted to look like in the past. And you'll see there were countless innovations predicted. And of course, some of them have come true and some of them have not. So now there are probably more transportation innovations under development now than any time in the past. They vary, they're diverse. They range from everything from e-bikes and e-scooters, autonomous vehicles, autonomous cars, public transit improvements, air taxis, or what you call flying cars, mobility as a service, so integrated transportation systems, pneumatic tube transport, and some other innovations that I'll be talking about in just a minute. So we are in this webinar, we're looking not at the technology, but the evaluation process by which transportation agencies and governments, policymakers can evaluate these new emerging technologies and make decisions about whether a particular technology should be encouraged or regulated, how it should be priced, and whether it should be limited or restricted or prohibited. So that's really the theme of this webinar. Let's see what we have. For this analysis, and in my book, I identify a dozen emerging transportation technologies and services. Everything from active travel, so improving walking and bicycling, and micro-mobilities, so e-scooters and e-bikes, technologies and services that allow sharing vehicles, so bike and scooter and car sharing, ride hailing and micro-transit, usually considered a private service, expanding on current taxi services, electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, public transit innovations. As I mentioned, mobility as a service, which are integrated services that provide apps that integrate multiple modes, telework, so telecommunications that substitute for physical travel, tunnel roads and pneumatic tube transport, aviation innovations, mobility prioritization, which is use of various new technologies to more efficiently price and regulate travel, and logistics management. So recognizing that freight transport and delivery services have important roles and innovations. These new services and modes present some really interesting questions for planners. So we can ask, how should we evaluate them? What are their costs and benefits? Who is impacted and in what ways? Who should bear the costs and the risks, for example, of the infrastructure for new modes and services? How should we integrate them into our current transportation system? And put briefly, should they be mandated, encouraged, regulated, restricted, or forbidden? So let's start off with just one example of the types of challenges or planning policy decisions that that communities are going to face. So there's a lot of enthusiasm, of course, for autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars. Now, proponents identify a number of benefits that that autonomous vehicles can provide, including things like increasing roadway capacity and therefore reducing traffic congestion, more fuel efficiency, and reducing emissions. Okay, that's great, but a lot of those benefits actually depend on those autonomous vehicles having dedicated lanes so they can platoon. That is, several vehicles can drive close together at relatively high speeds. Communities are going to have to decide at what point should highway agencies dedicate lanes to autonomous vehicles, and what should users pay for that privilege, and how should that pricing be enforced, and who is liable if one of those platoons has a multi-vehicle crash and you can't identify any individuals being culpable. You have to think about the additional risk that results when these vehicles are driving so close together. And we need to frame this in terms of overall efficiency and fairness. So we'll explore some of the implications of that. Let me give you another example. Many jurisdictions are developing transportation emission reduction plans. And in many of those plans, subsidizing electric vehicles is one of the biggest categories of one of the biggest strategies. Now, that's great. Electric vehicles do provide many benefits. They reduce energy consumption or non-renewable resource consumption and emissions. But electric vehicles, because they're relatively cheap, they have lower operating costs. They're probably going to be driven more annual miles. If somebody purchases an electric vehicle, they're likely to drive more annual miles than if they had a gasoline-powered vehicle. And so that's likely to increase some traffic problems. So there's some questions that communities are going to need to explore. How much should we subsidize electric vehicles compared with other emission reduction strategies? How can we structure these subsidies so they'll be equitable? And in particular, how can we ensure that lower income people benefit at least as much as wealthy people? And how can we prevent the rebound effects of the more vehicle travel? So I'm just introducing these examples as the types of issues that planners and policymakers are going to have to struggle with. And so now is the time for us to be thinking about how to approach this. Now, before we go into the new mobilities, let's take a little trip back and look at how some of the older technologies, transportation technologies, have affected our lives in our communities. So my book actually includes a chapter that revisits the economic impacts of previous transportation technologies. And one insight from this is that for most of history, newer modes were faster. So this graph shows on a logarithmic scale how over time our transportation system has accelerated people's ability to travel, the speed and distance that people can travel. And so this graph shows how during the last 120 years, our travel has changed. In 1900, people primarily traveled by walking. There was a little bit of public transit, and a little bit of bicycling, and a little bit of marine travel, but primarily most people, especially working class people, the average family, relied mostly on walking. And so the average person traveled about 1,000 miles a year. Over time, over the last century or so, motor vehicle travel has greatly accelerated the distances and the speed, and therefore the distance that people can travel, by an order of magnitude. We've increased average travel from about 1,000 to about 10,000 annual miles per capita. And one of the impacts of that is a huge increase in the dispersion of development, what you could call sprawl. So this graph, or this map, compares the area of walking cities like Rome and ancient Paris, and then London when you had local rail travel, and then Chicago in the last century when higher speed rail became common, and let's see, and then the highly sprawled, an example of a highly sprawled city such as Atlanta, Georgia. And you can see that as people were able to travel faster, we didn't actually save travel time, we increased our travel distances. And so you can pretty much predict that any increase in travel speed is going to translate into more sprawl. That's a pretty consistent result. And so from a planning perspective, we can ask, to what degree is that desirable? Here's another way to look at it. This chart compares the cost measured per mile and per person year for various forms of transportation. Walking and bicycling are cheap, especially when you recognize that people who rely on walking and bicycling don't travel nearly as far as people who rely on automobiles. And so the total cost, the cost per capita, have increased substantially as we've shifted from walking and bicycling and public transit to automobile travel. Now that increases not only our personal costs, the cost to us, the user, but also external costs. So this chart compares the annual costs, including some external costs, of various forms of transportation. And once again, you can say that as we've motorized, as we go from active travel, walking, bicycling, to public transportation, and then to personal automobile travel, costs increase. And in fact, currently, electric vehicles are significantly more costly, mainly because the current generation of electric cars cost more to purchase. And so and also they reduce some external costs, but they increase others, especially if they stimulate more annual travel. And so from an overall economic perspective, we want to make sure that we're considering all these costs, all these impacts when we evaluate a new technology. That's the message of this analysis. This graph shows how over time, over the last 120 years, total costs, including the cost to users and the external costs, have increased substantially due to motorization. And this graph looks at these issues from an interesting perspective, what we call effective speed, which measures your speed, taking into account both the time of travel, the time you spend traveling, but also the time you spend earning money to pay for your travel expenses. And what's important for what's interesting from this analysis, and important, I think, for planning for future innovative technologies, is that for many people, particularly lower income people, automobile travel is when measured using effective speed, automobile travel is not that fast, particularly for lower income people who have to spend relatively more time earning money to pay their travel expenses than wealthier people. And so you could say that automobile oriented or the higher, the more costly forms of transportation and planning that favors those more costly forms of transportation is inherently regressive. It's unfair to poor people. Or we can flip that around and we can point out that more affordable modes of transportation are inherently progressive and can benefit lower income people. So this analysis, to put it into perspective, or to put it to step back, we should acknowledge that there's a change in the way we're planning transportation, what we call a new transportation planning paradigm that tends to be more comprehensive and shifts from focusing on mobility, that is assuming that physical travel is an end in itself, to focusing on accessibility, that is recognizing that most travel, the ultimate goal is to access and be able to reach desired services and activities. And so our analysis of the new mobility should apply the new planning paradigm that considers some of these additional emerging planning issues and looks and evaluates the impacts based on accessibility, not just mobility. So let's get into some of these new mobilities. Let's start off with micro mobilities. That is these new forms of typically electric vehicles. They're small and light, things like e-bikes and e-scooters and mobility scooters. And of course, there's quite a range of them. And we've, in my book, I do some analysis of the impacts. Let me show you the next slide. Is the type of analysis that I apply in my book, and that I think planners should apply. And just using the micro mobilities as micro modes as an example, for the analysis, we ask, is it available? Or when will it be? And what's the user experience? And how does it affect the total amount that people travel? How does it increase or reduce travel speeds and travel time costs, and user costs and affordability, public infrastructure costs, congestion costs that travel imposes on other people, crash risk, both to the user and imposed on other road users, social equity, does it help improve mobility and opportunity for disadvantaged people, and does it increase affordability? Does it increase or reduce resources, non-renewable resource consumption? What about pollution emissions? How does it affect public fitness and health? Does it affect contagion risk? What are the effects on our strategic goals? Does it encourage smart growth, compact development? And what roles does it play? So for each of the new mobilities in my book, I answer or I explore these questions. And this, I'm not suggesting that other planners have to accept everything that all of my conclusions. My intent is to provide a framework that other planners and analysts can use and modify as needed, so that we do apply this comprehensive analysis of impacts. Okay, so let's look at another new mobility, vehicle sharing, car sharing, scooter sharing, bike sharing. These tend to provide benefits, especially compared with every individual owning their own car. So to the degree that they can help people reduce car ownership, that they leverage reductions in car ownership and therefore car use, they can provide very significant benefits. Another new mobility is ride hailing, which is really, from an economic perspective, a modification or an enhancement of conventional taxis. It's a somewhat more convenient and affordable taxi service that relies on apps, and so eliminates some of or makes it a little easier. And a variation of ride hailing is what we call microtransit, which is small vans or small vehicles that carry multiple passengers. Now, currently, ride hailing tends to be somewhat less expensive and more convenient than conventional taxi services, but these advantages are likely to decrease in the future as taxi companies develop their smartphone apps, and ride-hailing companies are going to have to become more profitable. Another new mobility is simply improving public transit services. So a number of innovations like more integrated apps for navigation and payment, and bus lanes, and more comfortable stations and vehicles, and amenities such as onboard internet, increased affordability, better integration with other modes, better marketing, increased social status. These are all things that we can be doing, that communities can be doing as part of their deploying new mobilities. Another category, and one that gets an awful lot of attention, is autonomous vehicles. And usually they're assumed to be electric autonomous vehicles. So I'm gonna address them together. Advocates or optimists predict that within just a few years, electric autonomous vehicles will become very common and replace conventional automobiles and automobile ownership. And there'll also be a great expansion of autonomous freight vehicles and autonomous buses. Now, let's look at some of the impacts, the benefits. And certainly there are some direct benefits to users. If your car can drive itself, it can reduce stress, and compared with, say, having a chauffeur or a paid taxi, a human-driven taxi, it's a lot cheaper. You can be more productive during travel, and it provides independent mobility for non-drivers. Those are significant benefits. And we can look at how quickly the new vehicles fleet market and the vehicle fleets could become dominated by autonomous electric vehicles. Now, optimists predict that this transition could take, say, just a decade, that by 2030, most vehicle travel would be in electric, autonomous, often shared vehicles. Now, my research suggests that that's way overly optimistic. There are a number of reasons for that. Vehicles are the optimists base their predictions on the rapid speed by which electronic technologies took over markets. So the speed with which, say, cameras went from film to digital, and the speed with which most people obtained smartphones and things like that, internet service. But vehicles are much more expensive, last longer, and involve far more risks than electronic technologies. And so my research suggests that even if the technology becomes predictable and affordable by, say, 2030, it will still take a couple decades before the electric autonomous vehicles can displace the majority of existing vehicles. And there are some reasons to think that most autonomous vehicle users will actually, or many will prefer to own their vehicles rather than rely on shared vehicles. And so you can't predict, I don't think that it's realistic to predict that within just a decade, the vehicle market will shift over to shared electric autonomous vehicles. And we can do some critical analysis of some of the potential benefits. Advocates predict that because human error contributes to about 90% of all traffic crashes, autonomous vehicles will reduce crashes by 90%. But that's ignoring some of the additional new risks that these technologies will introduce. And similarly, autonomous vehicle advocates predict that if we all go to shared autonomous vehicles, that they will reduce traffic congestion. There are good reasons to be skeptical. Our experience with new technologies such as ride-hailing shows that actually ride-hailing increases traffic congestion when it's introduced into a market. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the innovations and benefits of autonomous vehicles rely on them having dedicated lanes. And there's some good questions how quickly cities or transportation agencies highway agencies will decide to dedicate these scarce highway lanes to autonomous vehicles, so they'll only be used by people who can afford this new technology, and what those impacts will look like. So there's some good reasons to be skeptical. Autonomous vehicles are inherently expensive. They cost thousands of dollars more for the equipment, and so their user costs are likely to be higher for a privately owned autonomous vehicle. Now, an autonomous taxi will probably be quite a bit cheaper than a human-driven taxi, but still more expensive than your own car that you drive yourself or an autonomous privately owned vehicle. So the future costs to users and the future development and whether people shift from owning their own vehicles to shared vehicles will depend a lot on how these markets develop. So that's it's important to use that comprehensive analysis when we're asking how quickly we're going to see some benefits from new technologies, new mobilities such as autonomous vehicles. So here's my prediction is that some of the benefits could start accruing, say, in the next decade. Things like reduced stress and more independent mobility for affluent motorists, the ones who can purchase their autonomous vehicles when they first become commercially available in the next decade. And there could be significant benefits if autonomous buses and trucks are able to replace human operated and drive down some of those costs. But it will probably take a few decades before people the middle income and lower income people who rely on used vehicles will be able to purchase autonomous vehicles, and it will take many years before enough of the fleets are dominated by autonomous vehicles that we start to see some of the benefits, such as significant increases in safety. So a key question is, to what degree do autonomous vehicles increase or reduce vehicle travel? What are their travel impacts? And there are many ways that autonomous technologies could increase vehicle travel. Some ways it could reduce vehicle travels. And so my conclusion is that it's very contingent depending on the policies, that we could create a future in which autonomous technologies significantly increases traffic problems, or we could create a future in which they reduce traffic problems. Okay, let's go on to a few of the other new mobilities. Telework, being able to use telecommunications as a substitute for physical travel. And this can include everything from what we're doing right now, this webinar, to telework, telecommuting, so you're working at home rather than traveling to an office, e-education, e-commerce, e-business, e-government. These are all aspects. And certainly the current pandemic is proof of concept that many people can reduce their vehicle travel, can avoid mobility, can reduce their mobility by substituting telecommunications and delivery services. However, experience indicates that in many cases, it actually stimulates more vehicle travel. It encourages, for example, it encourages people to choose a more sprawled location. And so even if it, for example, it reduces your commuting trips, it may increase your non-commuting vehicle travel. And it's also can be regressive or unfair. There are many workers who simply can't take advantage of telework. So those are things that need to be considered when we evaluate telework as a pure substitute for physical travel. Another category of new mobilities are automobile technologies, infrastructure for automobile travel, and faster innovations in high-speed travel, things like tunnel roads. So there are people who propose that we can reduce urban traffic congestion by building networks of tunnels under cities, so you could drive from one neighborhood to another without congestion, and pneumatic tube transport, hyperloops, they're called, is one example. Very high speed transport in capsules from one location to another. There are some very optimistic predictions about how these could operate. Another category are aviation innovations, things like air taxis, that is a self-driving airplane, usually short takeoff and landing or horizontal liftoff. There's delivery drones and supersonic private jet travel. There are advocates for all of these. They're getting major investments in. There are major investments in air taxis, delivery drones, and even supersonic private travel. Planners are gonna need to think about how to incorporate these into communities. Another category of new mobilities, something somewhat different, is mobility prioritization. That is the use of new technologies and innovative services to prioritize higher value trips and more efficient modes over lower value trips and less efficient modes. So, and that could apply to both travel and parking. And there are many ways to do this, and a lot of communities are beginning to apply things like HOV priority and efficient road pricing, efficient curb and parking pricing. So it turns out this is actually one of the most important, although often overlooked, transportation innovations. And finally, the last new mobility considered in my book, and that I'm going to mention here, is freight logistics. That is using new technologies for more efficient freight and distribution, including things like cargo bikes and micro delivery vehicles. So for this analysis, I think it's very important to look at how these new mobilities affect the total amount of travel that people engage in. So in some of my analysis, I look at that question for each of these modes. And the leverage effect. So there are many ways that a new transportation technology or policy or service can affect total vehicle ownership and the total amount of travel that people engage in. And a lot of that is indirect. It's things like making it more convenient to use the slower local modes compared with long distance modes, reducing the amount of chauffeuring that people have to engage in. In many communities, 15% or so of peak period trips are people being chauffeured. And so reducing chauffeuring can reduce many trips. Encouraging more compact development, so smart growth development. All of these are leverage effects. And these impacts can be huge. Comparing say a sprawled automobile dependent suburb, people who live in compact transit oriented, or you could say walkable, compact neighborhoods drive far less, 40 to 60% or even 80% less than they would if they lived in a conventional automobile dependent area. So the degree that new mobilities support people shifting from automobile dependent sprawled areas to more compact multimodal neighborhoods has huge implications. And you can look at this from different perspectives. So our analysis of these different modes can look at it from a user's perspective, industry perspective, and community perspective. And each of those, these are all legitimate perspectives. It's important that analysts consider each of these and be explicit when you say something is good or bad. Are you thinking of it just from the user's perspective, just from industry's perspective, or just from the community's perspective, or from all of those perspectives? So let's go into some conclusions. And I recognize this is going to be a really quick summary of a whole bunch of very complicated issues. So hopefully this will stimulate some discussion and some questions. Okay, so vehicle innovations tend to be implemented more slowly than other technological change due to the high cost, strict safety regulations, slow fleet turnover, and I should mention the need for communities to provide infrastructure, or to the way that communities can support or restrict new mobility. So automobiles typically cost 50 times as much and last 10 times as long as electronic equipment, and so consumers seldom purchase a new vehicle simply to obtain a new technology. So vehicle innovations tend to take much longer than things like new electronic technologies. And most vehicle innovations or transportation innovations are initially costly and imperfect. It usually takes years or decades before they become common, before they are optimized. So predictions that autonomous electric taxis will soon be cheap and ubiquitous and displace most private vehicle travel are mostly made by optimists with financial interests in the industry. And there's good reason for planners and policymakers to be skeptical. There's considerable uncertainty concerning the new mobility's benefits, costs, and travel impacts. Advocates often exaggerate the net benefits by ignoring the new costs and risks that some of these technologies introduce, rebound effects, so the possibility that they will increase total vehicle travel and sprawl, and possible harms to people who don't use those new technologies. And some new mobility support, but others contradict social equity goals. If you are very concerned about affordability and economic opportunity for disadvantaged populations, it's important to consider those when we evaluate new mobilities. Many of the potential benefits of the new mobilities are contingent, depending on how they are implemented and regulated. And so it's going to be up to us, that is policymakers and planners, to optimize their benefits. There are many planning issues that policymakers and planners should become familiar with, things like their impacts on congestion and pollution and crash risk, affordability, parking, road and curb rights. And so summing up, I present some recommendations. It is important to test and regulate new technologies for safety and efficiency, and critically evaluate all impacts. So it is, I believe, important to support the slower modes and the more affordable modes that include active and micro mobilities and public transit, to take advantage of the potential for reducing parking requirements, and that we should plan and price to favor the resource efficient and affordable modes and prevent these new technologies from increasing total vehicle travel and sprawl. Now, I should emphasize, these are not just my ideas. There's been a lot of discussion. You might be familiar with some of the work that's been done, the principles for livable communities, shared mobility principles for livable cities, and they have specific recommendations for how we can integrate new mobilities in ways that maximize efficiency and equity. So that was a lot to cover. I encourage you, if these stimulate ideas, to consider purchasing my book. Also, much of the research that I just presented is available for free on the Victoria Transport Policy Institute website. You'll find lots of information on the benefits and costs and impact analysis. And so now we're going to be able to go into a poll that gets feedback from you on some of these questions that are raised by this analysis. So let's go to the polls.
Excellent. So as you can see, we have a question. How often do you encounter questions related to planning for new mobilities? We have 4 responses there. Never, seldom, which is less than monthly, sometimes, which is at least monthly, and finally frequently or weekly. And if you can respond to this, we'll leave this open for a few seconds. And then Todd can, after this, we'll see him on our screen and we'll go into Q&As. And thanks to everybody who submitted questions. We've gotten quite a few today. So we'll leave this open a couple more seconds and we'll see. It's a good split. So in this case, it's 36% sometimes, at least monthly, 35% seldom, less than monthly, 20% frequently, and only 9% never. So we'll go into the next question here. How well do you feel prepared to plan for new mobilities in your community? And you have 4 options here. You can select one. Number 1 is well, we have everything we need. 2, moderate, need better information concerning development. 3 is poor, need new analysis framework and basic information. And finally, very poor. We don't know where to start. We'll see where folks end up on this spectrum of response. And we'll leave this open a few seconds. Again, if you need to exit from full screen mode, that might be necessary to respond to it. And it looks like most folks are going to be in the middle. So 48% is moderate, 45% poor, 7% very poor, and only 1% has of the folks here have everything that they need. I think we have one more. Okay, so what new facilities, regulations, prices, and programs should your community implement to prepare for new mobilities? And we have 4 options here. You can select one of the 4. Better bikeways in anticipation of more micro mobilities, public transit improvements and mobility as a service, HOV lanes, road pricing, and curb regulations to favor shared modes. And finally, special regulations on and taxes on air taxi and delivery drones. So we'll leave this open for a couple more seconds. Looks like folks are responding, and thanks for participating today, both in attendance as well as responding to the polls and also asking the questions. We've gotten, like I said, quite a few. We'll try to get through as many as we can with Todd here. And I think we'll go ahead and close this one. So most of the response here is 43% better bikeways in anticipation of more micromobilities, 41% public transit improvements and mobility as a service, 14 HOV lanes, road pricing, and finally only 3% special regulations and taxes on air taxi and delivery drones. Okay, so with that, we're going to go ahead and move into the Q&A, and we'll have Todd turn on his camera so you can see him as we get into the conversation. And thanks, Todd. You have really spurred a lot of questions. And we'll go to about 2:30 Eastern here, so we have about 40 minutes to go through these. Okay, I guess one question is, and it came in early, what about high-speed rail?
Sure. First of all, I just want to say thank you to everybody who is participating and responded, and for the team that put this all together. But high-speed rail, sure. Of course, it's right there parallel with hyperloops or pneumatic tube transport. It certainly could play a role. I think my role is not to say something is good or bad, and the issues that we're exploring here is how should we evaluate these new technologies? I happen to love rail travel, and I have ridden on some high-speed rails and rail lines, and I think that the potential is important and provides significant benefits compared with air travel. So if your assumption is that high-speed rail is going to substitute for a significant portion of medium distance air travel, there are significant potential benefits, and I'm a great supporter. But that's what we need to look at, and we need to ask: what are the costs? What are the subsidies? What are the advantages over alternatives? And to what degree might high-speed rail encourage more traffic and more sprawl, and whether that's a desirable or undesirable effect. Now, the framework that I'm developing and sharing here really should be very flexible. I'm not suggesting that the new mobilities that I've identified are all that should be considered. The whole point is to be thinking about how to evaluate any of these emerging technologies. When somebody introduces a jetpack or a Star Trek transporter, we should be asking the same questions. So high-speed rail certainly deserves consideration. I agree.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, there's so many questions coming in that I'm kind of going through here. Next question is, how will the shape of our cities have to be in order to match these new mobilities? What do we have to do as planners to adapt our practices to all of the things you're talking about today?
Right, that is the million-dollar question. To what degree, what are the structural changes that could result from these new mobilities? Now, in the past, using the old transportation planning paradigm, the assumption was our goal is to maximize speed and therefore the distance that people can travel, and that sprawl is a desirable outcome or is a reasonable outcome, that it is perfectly fine to introduce and actually support a new mobility that stimulates the amount that people can travel and therefore sprawl. The new paradigm challenges that. It suggests that there are many significant costs to that increase in mobility and the sprawl that results, and that that to some degree, or is possible, that everybody would be better off overall if we favor the new mobilities that encourage reduced vehicle travel, that create more compact communities, and what you could call the 15-minute neighborhood communities, where people rely less on motor vehicle travel, particularly automobile travel, and much more on local services and destinations. And so you could ask, or you should ask, to what degree does a particular new mobility, and to what degree do the policies for implementing a new mobility support or reduce smart growth goals? And that, I think, is very important as we proceed. For example, one of the causes of sprawl are the large number of parking spaces that automobile travel requires. So, every time somebody buys a car, they're expecting their community to provide abundant parking spaces for that car. In most communities, in a typical community, there are 3 to 6 government mandated off-street parking spaces. That's a lot of land devoted to parking. And so, and it contradicts pretty much everything that we're trying to do with smart growth. So one of the questions is, how could our policies, how could new mobility implementation policies help reduce the number of parking spaces that are needed in a community, and use that to lever or to encourage people to use the more resource efficient modes of travel, and to encourage more compact infill development and discourage sprawl. So we could go through the list of the dozen new mobilities and identify which ones reduce or increase, to what degree they reduce or increase parking supply requirements, and to what degree do our parking policies favor or contradict these strategic goals. I mean, just it's a related issue, is that if parking is priced but road use is free, it will actually be cheaper for many people to send their self-driving car just to drive around in circles around the block continuously for hours on end, rather than pay for an off-street parking space. So one of the implications of my research is that some of the new mobilities, particularly autonomous electric vehicles, provide a huge urgency, or imply that there's an increased urgency for pricing roads, so people with self-driving cars won't just add to traffic congestion. The risk is huge that our cities our city streets could be filled with cars avoiding parking. So that's just an example of the type of analysis that we should lead. We need to become conversant on these issues and be able to present them to policymakers and the general public.
Okay, thanks, Todd. And we recognize there's a bit of a screen issue right now. We're trying to fix that. Next question is, actually a comment and a question from Michael Greenwald, who says, you make a compelling case regarding equity in the use of transportation modes. I'm curious if you consider the same concerns for online shopping and delivery services. How one gets to the grocery store is a moot point if they have the ability to order their shopping and have it delivered. This also has significant equity impacts.
Absolutely. This is an example of the very interesting issues that transportation planners and community planners face, and raises the question: how should we apply? How should we explore those issues when they apply to new mobilities that are still, let's say, innovative and maybe not fully developed? So certainly there are, you can definitely say that there are potential inequities and equity. There are ways that something like telework and delivery services and online shopping can either enhance or reduce social equity goals. And so we should be exploring that. Specifically, not everybody has a high-speed internet access, and not everybody is comfortable using online tools, and not everybody has a house with the privacy that you need to have an at-home office and be able to do productive work at home. And different locations have different qualities of delivery services, as it should be. I mean, it costs an awful lot more for UPS to deliver a package in a sprawled exurban area than it does in a compact urban area. So by all rights, urbanites shouldn't be subsidizing the delivery costs of exurban people, but we need to be, those are factors that should be considered when we develop policies regarding things like how we should develop high-speed internet services, what the price of those high-speed internet services should be, how businesses, how employers should be able to offer or demand things like telework, and whether a community should devote a lot of resources to making it easier for delivery services to get to your house. Those are all really important issues that we should be discussing as telework and delivery services become integrated into our communities.
Thanks, Todd. Actually, along these lines, one of our audience members asked what your thoughts are on the term gadget bon.
Well, it's true. I mean, to me, what's interesting, going back to the third slide, was that image of all these exciting new technologies that were on the covers of Popular Mechanics and Popular Science, where the assumption was the future was going to be better because new technologies were going to be able to transport us faster and farther. The assumption was it's always good that these new transportation technologies are inherently beneficial. And so an awful lot of our policies, our transportation and land use development are, I would say, biased in favor of faster and more expensive modes of travel to the detriment of slower, older, more affordable, healthy, and resource efficient forms of travel and forms of access. This, by the way, is discussed in another report that I just completed called Not So Fast, and you can see it, you can get it on our website or visit the Planet Isn't blogs, and I just posted a blog about it. And it's asking to what degree is our planning, our transportation planning decisions biased in favor of faster modes to the detriment of slower modes. These are all really important issues, and part of the bias is that the people I believe that people involved in the decision-making process, that is planners and policymakers and economists, tend to be people who they tend to be busy professionals with moderate to good incomes, and so they're some of the people that benefit a lot from the faster modes of travel. They benefit, that is busy professionals, tend to benefit a lot from automobile travel and air travel, and could benefit a lot from telework. And so there may be inherent bias in the planning process in favor of what you could call gizmos or newer technologies. My insight is that we need to critically analyze the degree that our planning is biased in favor of, depending on the audience, you would say faster modes over slower modes, or more expensive modes over cheaper modes, or sedentary modes over healthier modes, or resource intensive modes over resource efficient modes, or compact development over sprawl development. These are all ways of describing what I believe are current biases or potential biases in the planning process. Does that ring true, or do other people involved in this call, in this webinar, would they agree that our planning process needs to be reevaluated? That's what I hope we can explore here.
And folks can respond with comments through the questions tab, and we can read some of those if you want to respond to that particular question. So we've gotten a few requests. Todd, if you could share the website that you have, as well as if you could repeat the promo code for your book.
Right. So let me up. I will put, there we go. So the promo code good at the Island Press website is SMART, capital S, capital M-A-R-T. Let's see, is that?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. And my website, Victoria Transport Policy Institute website, is vtpi.org.
Okay. So
and
in response, go ahead. Go ahead, Todd.
Well, if anybody has any specific questions later on, you can send me an email directly at litman@vtpi.org.
Yes, and that your email is up on the screen. So in response to what you were just saying, Todd, we have a comment from Jay Lambrix who says, I completely agree. It seems like most of the answers to the issues that have been raised in this discussion are not in fact technological, but are in fact structural. If we have transportation infrastructure that encourages higher VMT and sprawl, new technologies will respond to that dynamic and have greater potential to exacerbate the negative externalities of that system. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Bingo, yes, absolutely. And let me translate that into career advice. And that is, I'm assuming that most people on at this webinar are professional planners or analysts, policy analysts. And these issues that we're discussing here are examples of emerging planning issues. So a lot of policymakers, a lot of the general public, a lot of businesses, in other words, a lot of the clients for planning are asking these very questions. They're interested in how communities and in particular government agencies should address the new mobilities as they become commercially available and people start relying on them. And if you happen to be one of the first planners or policy analysts that becomes familiar with these issues, you don't have to have all the answers, but if you are a little bit more informed than the other planners or policy analysts, you can quickly become the regional expert in this field. So I can predict that these questions that we're discussing are not going to disappear. There are going to be more and more questions about how, let's say, a local government or a department or Ministry of Transportation or a regulatory body should address these new mobilities, and how individuals or businesses should respond. There are going to be lots and lots of questions. So the more familiar you can get with the basic issues and develop a vocabulary, the more prepared you're going to be as these issues come up. And you too could become a rich and famous transportation planner or policy analyst because you're helping communities answer these questions. So my advice is anticipate the emerging planning issue. That's my career advice.
That was kind of a bonus question there, Todd. Appreciate you adding to that. So here's the next question here is, by being dependent on the new mobilities is predicated that all jobs are at employment centers, warehousing, manufacturing, et cetera, are not viewed as desirable jobs in residential areas. If all jobs are not all transit accessible in a timely period, less than 15 minutes, should land use policies change or should transportation policies change?
Right. Well, of course, that raises all kinds of questions. So let me kind of flip it around and give my general advice. And my general advice is start with a vision of how you want your community to be organized in the long-term future. Set what you could either call a vision or a set of goals or strategic goals or targets, where you would say your community, you would work with your community and determine what is important, what you're trying to achieve. And based on that, I would say that you want to design your community to maximize the benefits of existing and new transportation technologies, and be willing to regulate those that contradict that vision, so that your transportation policy follows your strategic vision or goal. Let me just give you an example. I'm a great advocate for active transportation, that is walking and bicycling and variants. And that require to be, and now the micro modes, that is e-bikes and scooters and their variants, can essentially double the number of trips that could be made without a car. So there's good research showing that in a typical community, we could increase walking and bicycling by expanding to include micro mobilities. Walking and bicycling and other relatively slow local modes could go from, say, 10 to 15% of trips up to easily 30%, and with proper support, even more. So it would be normal, for example, there would be far fewer parents chauffeuring their children to school by car or driving their kids to the sporting events, and far more families walking and bicycling and using e-bikes and scooters, and adolescents traveling independently. Okay, that is, I think, a very positive image or vision if you're interested in social equity and resource efficiency, in emission reductions, in infrastructure cost savings, so you're reducing the amount of money and land that has to be invested in roads and parking facilities, and you're improving public fitness and health and reducing crash rates. All of these are benefits that can result if we create the new term is 15-minute neighborhoods. Okay, that's great. The question is, how can what would it take? So every time planners consider a new mobility, consider how to incorporate freight transport, logistics, high-speed rail, or hyperloops, or neighborhood air taxi services, that any of those are planned and regulated to ensure that they don't contradict the vision of a 15-minute neighborhood, where most households rely frequently on walking and bicycling, and including e-bikes and scooters, and that we're willing to say no. I mean, it does require, you could call it discipline or a prioritization, to be able to say that even though air taxis could provide some increased mobility for some affluent residents in a community, that the noise and risk created by air taxis, and the fact that it is inherently regressive, it is unfair to poor people, because it means wealthier people are imposing external costs on people who can't afford this expensive mode, that we're just not going to have it in this neighborhood. And then you have to ask, what would that, how would we determine where an air taxi terminal should locate, and whether it should be subsidized or priced for cost recovery and things like that. So if I understand the question correctly, I would say that every time we evaluate the new mobilities, decisions related to planning for the new mobilities, it should always be based on our understanding of strategic goals.
Thanks, Todd. Next question here, I think kind of follows from what you were just saying. It's from Shane Shaughnessy, who says, there's plenty of communities who are still struggling with the basics of transportation, for example, lacking bike infrastructure or reliable transit. Shouldn't communities focus on getting these basics completed before considering new mobility options that may or may not come to fruition?
Sure, although they're in no way contradictory. In fact, in some ways, I think the idea that or the fact that micromodes, so electric e-bikes and scooters, allow a whole bunch of people who weren't previously bicyclists to consider relying on those modes and to travel a little bit farther distance. So go from assuming that a bike trip will be 2 miles maximum, can now go to, say, 5 miles maximum. Those become an excuse or become a justification for communities to invest a whole lot more in active travel and walking and bicycling and micromobility facilities. So you could say, and the same would apply to public transportation. So the enthusiasm that some people have for new technologies could be used to justify significant investments in, say, bus terminals and train stations and HOV lanes, bus lanes. And remember that I did include transportation prioritization, mobility prioritization, as one of the new mobilities. I think we could do a lot to communicate first the threat that some of these new mobilities, especially self-driving cars, present. They could increase traffic congestion by huge amounts. Where instead of somebody driving to work and generating 2 trips a day, to work and back home, they're gonna have their car drive them to work, then to avoid paying for parking, the car will drive home, and then the car will drive back to the work site and then drive them home. So you've just doubled the amount of vehicle trips by people, by electric vehicle owners. And so that risk of huge increases in traffic congestion might motivate decision makers to take efficient road pricing seriously. Now, I've been a advocate for efficient road pricing, or what you could call decongestion pricing, for decades. But there are very few of us. We're alone voices to say people should pay more for road use than they do now. But maybe the threat of all this traffic congestion and traffic problems associated with self-driving cars may be the key that people start taking some of those reforms and innovations seriously. So I think it's our challenge to frame the excitement about some of these new mobilities to emphasize, to frame them in terms of strategic goals, things like increasing community health and affordability and emission reduction goals and things like that, so that every time we discuss, every time a community discusses the new mobilities, we're talking in terms of their support or contradiction of strategic goals.
Thanks, Todd. Next question is from one of our colleagues here at the Maryland Department of Transportation, who's asking, the current business models of shared AV mobility across the nation are currently showing a lower fare than human-driven shared mobility solutions. Is it possible that businesses will find a solution where AV shared mobility is in fact lower and not higher as is shown here, and thus be more socially equitable?
Absolutely. I mean, the dream of cities being full of self-driving taxis to the point that many or most households choose not to own a car. They're going to rely on these self-driving taxis. That's a beautiful dream and has the potential of increasing equity, social equity, or helping it to achieve some social equity goals. I'm totally in agreement to that. On the other hand, I don't think that self-driving taxis will ever be as affordable, as convenient, or as pleasant as the optimists predict. A lot of times, I mean, think about the last time you went to a heavily used, let's say, public elevator or something like that, and you saw, and it's stained and worn, and maybe a little smelly. Well, self-driving taxis are likely to be that way, that the people will often find garbage left by previous users, suspicious stains and odors. So yes, self-driving taxis will be cheaper, somewhat cheaper than human-driven taxis. But actually, I think many people will actually prefer the human-driven, given the option. They will actually choose the premium quality taxi service where there's a human driver rather than the self-driving taxi. The self-driving taxi, I think, will be the cheaper but less pleasant option. There won't be anybody to keep it clean or to have a conversation or to give you advice when you're visiting a new town. So I think that it will be somewhat different than proponents are predicting, that it won't be quite so nice and quite so cheap. When you take into account the full costs of operating a taxi, including the need for profit and going to cleaning stations and paying for road use, I suspect that self-driving taxis will be about half the cost of a human-driven taxi. So it'll go from about $2 per passenger mile to $1, but it won't go down to 10 cents, the 10 cents a mile that some proponents are predicting. As a result, self-driving taxis will be affordable and convenient if they're part of a mix of mobility options. So the average household goes from owning their own cars to relying on a combination of walking and bicycling, public transit, and self-driving taxis, but you're not going to go from your current, let's say, 12,000 annual miles of driving to 12,000 annual miles of self-driving taxi passenger travel. No, you're going to go from 12,000 miles of current driving to, let's say, 2,000 miles or 1,000 miles of walking, 3,000 miles of e-biking, 2,000 or 3,000 miles of high quality public transit service, and 2,000 or 3,000 annual miles of self-driving taxi. But it's got to be envisioned as part of a mobility ecosystem, not as a total substitute for automobile ownership and use.
Thanks, Todd. So we'll have a few more minutes, ask you a few more questions and do some wrap-up thoughts, Todd. Next question here is actually about freight. Will freight be an early adopter for AV? They have an aging workforce and shortage of new drivers entering that profession.
Right. So, of course, let me emphasize my role, or I am not. I cannot predict the future. I have no magic crystal ball, so I can't say for sure. What I can say is that there are significant potential logistical efficiencies that new technologies and some of these new modes can achieve, and they will be achieved most if we apply smart growth development policies that create more compact neighborhoods where things like cargo bikes and robot autonomous delivery vehicles can operate efficiently. So as in my book, there's a lot of discussion about having delivery distribution centers that in the middle of a neighborhood, that there would be very efficient automated systems that instead of one truck driving to, or instead of 10 trucks, each driving a limited number of products to 10 destinations, creating 100 trips, there would be big trucks making deliveries in this neighborhood distribution center, and those deliveries would be broken down to the most efficient vehicle for that type of delivery, which in some cases would be smaller electric automated delivery vehicles, in some cases cargo bikes. And then each of those optimizes to deliver to those destinations. And so everything becomes more efficient. The potential is huge. And keep in mind, even though freight only represents about 10% of trips, of vehicle trips, it represents about 30% of energy consumption and pollution emissions, and is a major contribution to urban traffic congestion. So more efficient logistics could provide very large benefits and make communities more livable. So I do think there's a lot of potential, and yes, if you're familiar with the freight delivery industries, they are very concerned about getting employees. I think that there will be still a need for having an employee on a lot of these vehicles. So the truck might drive itself, but you still need somebody there to help load and unload, and to sign manifests and things like that. So it may be a little bit, it might not be quite as automated as some people envision, but there are, if we think of it systematically, so we're looking at the whole system and a community plans for freight delivery optimization, we already have experiences, some of them discussed in my book, about the successes of increasing freight logistical efficiencies.
Thanks, Todd. So just a couple more here, and then we'll ask you to wrap. Next question here is, what about digitized end-of-trip facilities? How much of a priority are these for municipalities to include in planning for micro-mobility's success, such as lockers, bike rooms?
Right. So as some of you might know, the current term a lot of people are using, especially in the transportation engineers and planners, is a mobility hub. It's what we used to call a train station. So an interesting detail is, if you look at a community, at a transit-oriented development community, where a lot of people rely frequently on public transportation, the train station, or in some cases bus station, naturally becomes a multimodal hub. Lots of different buses and taxis and shared vehicles. So you could have some car sharing and bike and scooter sharing, and a bunch of related services. So there's a magazine shop and a little restaurant, and all those things are at and possibly a bike repair shop, and a lot of bike parking. All those things can be at that, what we now call a mobility hub, and all that. So it's all about connectivity. It's all about recognizing that our goal is to maximize accessibility from, let's say, door to door. So not only the time, but also the experience, the convenience and comfort that people experience when they're shifting from one mode to another becomes critical. If you are, let's say, if I was just giving an example, I grew up in Southern California, Los Angeles region. If I was visiting Los Angeles now and I wanted to not rent a car, I might want to, I might want to take advantage of some of the new train services. I would be very interested. My ability to not rent a car and rely instead on public transportation will depend a lot on the ease of getting information, the ease of paying for tickets and renting car share vehicles and bike share vehicles, on the confidence that I could have that one of those vehicles, the vehicle that I need, is going to be waiting for me and available and reasonably clean when I get there at that moment, that I'm not going to have to wait a while, and that I'm going to be able to navigate to my ultimate destination. These are all the components of a really successful mobility hub. And so I think, it's going to be up to us, planners and policy analysts, to think about these mobility hubs, dream about what a beautiful mobility hub, a full service mobility hub should look like, and how to integrate each of the new mobilities as they develop into these facilities.
Thanks, Todd. That's a good response. I guess our last question today says, the Pony Express required a massive investment. Yes, it was only in business for 3 years before it was replaced by new technology, the telegraph. Does it really make sense to invest in current technologies when new ones are almost here?
Well, yeah, although you can find plenty of examples of new modes that were, let's say, underinvested or poorly planned or inadequately planned. So sure, we can point to lots of examples of new transportation technologies that were overhyped. They were exaggerated, they were poorly planned. For what it's worth, my son was an operator for one of the U-Bike, a bike sharing program here in our city, Victoria, and it lasted for about a year, and we experienced personally the challenges of setting up one of these bike share services, and it eventually failed. So there are certainly plenty of examples of new mobilities that were tried and failed. I think that's our challenge, is set a vision or a dream, such as that there should be mobility hubs that have car and bike and scooter sharing services in them, and then look at the success stories and the failures when businesses tried to do that, and did they work, did they fail, and then digging down. This is the thing, you have to be careful about these narratives, because people will point to the failure of say a bike share service in one town, or a bike share service that seemed regressive in some way, and say, therefore, we shouldn't even try. And my message is, no, let's understand what constitutes success and what constitutes failure, and the factors that contribute to those. Let's dig down. Let's become planning professionals that understand these issues. And then we can use that information. We might determine, oh, in this location, bike sharing is not going to be successful, so we're not even going to try this mobility hub. But it could say, we could conclude, hey, this bike sharing service could succeed here in this mobility hub if it has these attributes, if it's designed in this way. It might even include a requirement for subsidies. Keep in mind, we subsidize public transit. We subsidize car ownership and use with abundant parking supplies. We subsidize air travel with all those airports that receive various tax exemptions and support. There's no reason that we should, that bike sharing, car sharing, scooter sharing should never receive a subsidy, but it's going to be up to us, the planners and policy analysts, to explain why in a particular location supportive policies and in some cases subsidies are justified. And then to go right into the details. What should that look like? What technologies, what pricing technologies, and integrated, and what kind of apps should be used, and things like that. So all of these introduce all kinds of really important, interesting, what I would call fun planning questions. And it's going to be up to the good people in this webinar, I think, to take this, to actually apply it in particular communities.
Great, thanks, Todd. And thanks to everybody who submitted questions today. We had many, many, many more than we could get to. Just wanted to give you, I guess, a final opportunity, Todd, to share with us kind of your takeaways and what we should think about as we depart today and review everything that you've shared.
Right, well, just very briefly, I think we live in an exciting and challenging time. And the new mobilities, these new transportation technologies and services, are a really good example of the opportunities and challenges that planners and policy makers and policy analysts face. We can help create paradise on earth. We can create communities. We can help communities make decisions that result in more efficient, equitable, inclusive, environmentally responsible transportation systems, or we can help create hell. Some of the community planning decisions can unintentionally favor the unfair, expensive, inefficient, harmful modes of travel, and it's perfectly possible. This is the interesting thing about my analysis, my looking at the economic history of previous transportation technologies, which, by the way, is that chapter is also I turned it into a report called Our Accelerated World, available free on our website. The finding was that it's possible to travel much faster and much farther and actually be worse overall. That an increase in mobility is not necessarily beneficial. On the other hand, there are lots of situations where increasing mobility, increasing travel speed, and the distance can be very beneficial. So we need to discern where new mobilities are really efficient and equitable, and then develop the policies that help achieve that goal. So I hope that's information and inspiration to many of you to take these ideas and take them to the next level. That is to figure out how to apply the insights of my research in your communities or in your agencies.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Todd. That was very inspirational. It gave us some things to work on and think about. Appreciate that. So with that, that's going to conclude our webinar today, New Mobilities, Smart Planning for Emerging Transportation Technologies. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to Todd Litman for a great presentation, to everyone who attended, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those of you who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email. I know many people are using these. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. And please keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including the first one that we're going to be doing that was going to offer CM law credits. With that, I offer you goodbye and have a great day.